The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. After World War II, we saw successful state building in Germany and Japan, but recent attempts, such as in Somalia and Iraq, suggest that nation creation may no longer work. Today we discuss the feasibility of state building with Francis Fukuyama, author of State Building, Governance and World Order in the 21st Century. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Francis Fukuyama, welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch. Let's talk about state building. You wrote a book on the subject called State Building, Governance and World Order in the 21st Century, but it's a topic you've addressed in a number of other places as well, and you teach at a School of International Development. When George Bush ran for president, he said the United States isn't good. I'm oversimplifying, isn't very good at state building. We're not going to try it. And then something changed. I guess that was September 11th?
That's right. I think that there's a traditional view of foreign policy that says that you just regard everybody out there as a sovereign state, and what sovereign states do inside their borders is none of your business. And that's the basis of realism in international relations theory and practice. But I think that it's increasingly hard to take that position in today's world, because what goes on the inside of states very much affects their external behavior. And so many of the international problems are driven by things like, infectious diseases, refugees, weapons programs that spill over borders, and therefore, and certainly in terms of things like poverty, HIV, AIDS, all of these terrible problems in developing countries, that is something that needs to be addressed on the inside of states and not externally. And so therefore, this old distinction between the inside and outside of states, I think, is one that it's increasingly hard to maintain.
Well, I'm quite surprised at your answer, because and we'll talk about it, because I thought you were also going to talk about weak or almost failed states that dot the globe as well.
Yeah, that's since September 11th been a major focus, and in fact the Bush administration has bought into this wholeheartedly, that we thought for a while in the 1990s that you could ignore what went on in Somalia, Afghanistan, but they were also breeding grounds for terrorism, and so therefore you had to be able to reach into the inside and make sure that that didn't happen.
So that almost sounds as if that doctrine would say we need to go into places like Afghanistan.
Well, that's only part of the analysis.
Go ahead.
I think that you can show that governance, how a state is governed, is incredibly important for all sorts of reasons. So some of them have to do with foreign policy, how the state, whether it fosters terrorists or bothers its neighbors or creates refugees and so forth, and the health and well-being of its own people. The other side of the equation, though, is what outsiders can do to improve governance in other countries, and that's a whole different kettle of fish, because I think the experience of what's now called nation building around the world is an extremely mixed one, and particularly for the United States is one that is not a terribly happy story. Before the Iraq War, Condi Rice and other administration officials pointed to nation building after the war in Germany and Japan, and said, well, we've done it before, and we can do it again in Iraq. I think they probably should have been paying more attention to South Vietnam and Nicaragua and a lot of countries, Philippines, a lot of countries in our traditional sphere of influence, where we've invested huge amounts of time and capital and lives for what were often fairly meager results.
Can you think of any successes in the last 100 years in nation building by either?
Well, you have
the
to
US?
reach back into the history of colonialism. In a certain way, modern India was a product of British nation building because there wasn't an India before the British got there. There was a bunch of princely states and the Mughal Empire, and they didn't think of themselves as a single country. And so, what does nation building really consist of? It consists of building state institutions, but also things like shared language, common bureaucracy, common sense that you're living in a shared political space. You tell your children the same kinds of stories that relate you to this larger political community. And that actually happened. They got English as a language in India and an army and a bureaucracy, but it took 200 years to do. And so it's very, very difficult to see other cases that have been similarly successful.
And still a major civil war.
Oh, yeah, sure, with partition
and millions of people killed.
That's right. That's right.
So it seems to be always a dirty business.
And the worst, some of the worst outcomes are half-hearted nation building, where you go in and don't really do the job of creating real institutions because you want to do it on the cheap, or you get tired of the job. I think we Americans are particularly guilty. I think there's about a 5-year window in which we can generate domestic enthusiasm for a nation-building project. And after we realize it's really tough and the results aren't coming in, we get tired. So that happened in Nicaragua, for example, when the Marines were sent in 1927. By 1932, they were out again in South Vietnam. It was roughly 5 years from the first intervention until the Tet Offensive by the time we decided we'd had enough. So it's morally, I think, something we need to think really hard about, because if you do one of these interventions with all of these good intentions to bring stability, order, good government, democracy to a troubled country, and you're not willing to stick it out, very frequently you can leave those countries worse off than they were before. In Latin America, I think we left actually a legacy. The one thing we could build was a good police force like the National Guard in Nicaragua, and then that becomes an instrument of oppression once we're out of there.
So far you've talked about examples where there's been American military force used, but as you've written in other places, soft power, economic power, advice, government aid are all other tools. If I may, let's go on a little bit of a tour of the globe and think about those softer exercises of American leadership. In the late 70s, early 80s, we had massive changes in Latin America. More democracy, more market economies, and we seem to be receding from that. Now, what's happened? What can you tell us about Latin America?
Well, the United States did play a certain role, particularly in Chile. At the time of the coup against Salvador Allende, we basically backed the military, and then in the 1988 no referendum, we switched sides and we told Allende that he had to step down, and I think that's why he, not Allende, but Pinochet, that he had to step down. But basically, I think the shift in Latin America is due to other forces. We had a model of development that we promoted very heavily in the 80s and 90s as a result of the debt crisis, which is now called the Washington Consensus, which is a pretty straightforward, orthodox, liberal economist's view of how development happens.
We should talk about that, balance the books.
Yeah, I mean, good macroeconomic policy management, stop running budget deficits, no hyperinflation, get your budget under control, which actually, to be quite honest, worked pretty well in a lot of big Latin American countries, in Brazil and Mexico and Argentina. The problem was that it was not sufficient to produce sustained growth. And in the case of a country like Argentina, the reforms didn't, well, it was a complicated crisis that they got into in 2001, and it looked like it was a big failure. The deeper problem, I think, was that a lot of times this kind of market-led growth does not address the poor, or that it leads to, if it starts in a country like most Latin American countries are, with highly unequal income distribution, a lot of times it simply exacerbates that disparity, and a lot of the benefits don't reach these large masses of poor or marginalized people. And so we're in the middle of a reaction, particularly in the Andean countries. There have been some real successes, because I think actually Brazil and Mexico are doing much better than you would have thought 20 years ago, but clearly there's a widespread belief pushed by Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez and leaders like that, that what they call neoliberalism was a big failure.
Well, I remember the one and only time I was in Venezuela, so I don't want to seem like an instant expert. There was this tremendous wealth downtown, and then mountainsides covered with hovels, and the expressways drove right by, and it was really quite striking.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Venezuela. I think almost all of those countries suffer from a legacy, highly stratified societies, and so you can get economic growth for a certain period, but then you get political instability because that growth is not fairly distributed, and so you really got to solve that problem.
I don't have the feeling that Brazil or Argentina, even Mexico, are in what we think of as the globalized economy. I don't remember buying anything from Argentina.
You probably flew in an Embraer airplane flying to Milwaukee, which is
Brazilian. But that's it?
No, I think this is something that people don't quite understand, that the larger Latin American countries actually are becoming pretty important global players. Now, a lot of that is through commodities, traditional commodity exports, but increasingly you're getting high-tech, one of the largest cement companies in the world is a Mexican multinational. I mean, so I think that story is actually developing, but it should have happened faster. And given the East Asian example, this kind of integration into the global economy has really not been moving ahead in that part of the world as fast as it really should have been.
What makes East Asia different?
I think that it is entirely a matter of state capacity and better governance. Particularly the countries in Northeast Asia, in their pre-modern period, had a tradition of strong, coherent governments. And they just had the wrong policies. In China's case, they had communism or, various other fads. But once they got that policy formula right, they could just go to town because they had governments that could actually enforce laws, property rights, could regulate adequately, and so forth. And I think at the other extreme are a lot of sub-Saharan African countries that were acephalous before the Europeans got there. The Europeans didn't do any favors for them in colonialism in terms of creating real institutions. And so they've been suffering from just unbelievably weak state institutions. And then Latin America is somewhere in between.
Well, the African governmental institutions, it seems to me, were almost built to be weak. You take what was a former colony, and it had two or more tribes, one an ascendant tribe, call it a democracy, let people vote, and it seems almost inevitable to me that the larger tribe will decide it wants to stay in power.
You had states whose borders didn't really make any sense in ethnic terms, and therefore very difficult to consolidate real states. Sudan, it was just an accident of some British administrator that South Sudan was given to Sudan rather than to Uganda, and they've been fighting a 30-year civil war ever since then. And there's that, but I think that there's a deeper lack of traditions of stateness, and the East Asians have that. They had it before they even began the modernization process.
But I want to stay for a minute with Africa. So people like, I think, Sam Huntington would say, what they need is 100 years of wars to build their armies, which would therefore build their governments and make for stronger governments. Is that just a parody of the analysis, or is there something there?
Well, it's not going to happen. If you want to get discouraged about development, you think about Europe's history. It turned out successful by the 20th century, but Europe went through unremitting, several hundred years of warfare as 300 sovereign entities consolidated down to the 25 that existed on the eve of World War I, and it was a tremendously bloody experience. And I think that no developing country, you just can't say that to developing countries, that they've got to go through that. Plus which, actually, if you develop late, you ought to be able to learn some lessons from all these mistakes that people made earlier on. So I don't think that that's the right solution. But I do think that people that think that there are easy answers to the development problem are really forgetting how painful it was to create these institutions in the history of the West itself.
So what is the way to think about this more macro problem in Africa for now, where this is weak governments, borders that may or may not make any sense, some countries natural resource rich, others not? How do you think about the next 30 or 50 years in Africa?
I think that it's not just Africa, it's development in general. Donors and the international community do not lead development efforts. These things have to be owned and located in the countries themselves, and if the conditions are fundamentally not right, no amount of outside pressure and aid is going to help that situation. And in fact, there are a lot of cases where aid actually undermines governance because if you can get a foreign donor to do something, collect taxes or enforce, distribute health care, why bother to create those institutions yourself? And so you can do a lot of damage, I think, from the outside. So that's the fundamental insight. What the outsiders can do is create...
Let's spend a moment on that, though, because I was struck by that in some of your writings. And you talk about, for example, there's a NGO that wants to provide some kind of health care. Mm-hmm. And it first tries by going through the government. And the money gets siphoned away in some form of corruption. And the people are suffering. So the outside donor organization decides it's going to create its own organization within the country. Mm-hmm. And so it has to populate the agency so it hires the best people it can, often from the government.
Right.
And it's now created a parallel government. It's weakened whatever responsibility. Have I got this right? Yeah,
well, in the lingo of international development, it's called capacity development. It's called capacity building, and in reality, it's capacity sucking out, because what you're doing is creating a parallel structure to the existing government, because the existing government is incapable of delivering basic services, and you want those services delivered, and so you do it yourself. But in the meantime, you undermine the ability of the state to actually function, and then the donors get tired and they pull out, and countries left with nothing. So it's a very big danger. But I think that people that do this sort of thing recognize that this is a problem. In Afghanistan, after the Taliban were driven out, something like 2,000 foreign NGOs descended on that country. And
this is 2,000 organizations, not 2,000 people.
2,000 organizations, right, descended on Afghanistan. And the first finance minister, Ashraf Ghani, it just drove him crazy, because he had basically lost control of his country. And you can't really create an Afghan state under those circumstances. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So have these NGOs learned their lesson? What's the next step?
NGOs follow their own incentives. I think people that do development realize that this is a big problem, but then it puts you into the horns of this terrible dilemma. There are children that need to be vaccinated. There are people dying of infectious diseases. The existing healthcare system isn't working, and you really need to get those services out there. And so do you do the short-term service delivery, or do you worry about the long-term development? And I would not presume to judge, how you decide on that trade-off, because a lot of times, certainly in a humanitarian crisis, you're going to say, well, we just can't worry about the long-term consequences, because people are dying of hunger, or they need shelters and so forth. So I think it's a very complicated issue that has really not got a neat solution to it.
How much would lower barriers to agricultural goods or whatever help the third world?
There's, I think there's virtual unanimity of agreement on this among the policy people that look at this, that the one thing that developed countries could do to help poor countries is in agricultural, particularly in agricultural products, but to some extent in low-skill manufacturing. If you reduced trade barriers, there are lots of cases of this. Right now, we protect our local American sugar industry by putting a tax on sugarcane ethanol. And that, if we let this stuff in, it would be a win-win-win in many respects, because corn ethanol is not efficient. It doesn't make any sense in policy terms. What sugarcane ethanol does, who produces this? Well, poor people or poor countries in the Caribbean, and it would be a tremendous boon to them. But
in our backyard, by the way.
In our backyard, but politically, Florida is an important state, and you have to protect these domestic sugar interests. So there are lots, and you can multiply this. Cotton, there's just a lot of commodities where we're actually doing a lot of harm.
So if you were the director of whatever, what's it called, the Millennium?
Well, there's the American Institution of Millennium Challenge Corporation.
Sure. So if you were the head of that, what would be your first act besides internationalizing the corporation? Because I know that's how you feel.
I think that we need to take a run at the governance dimension of development, because that's really where the big problems lie. But with this realization that we cannot actually fix these problems directly, we can, provide an accommodating environment for political actors in developing countries to do.
How do we do that?
Part of it is just a matter of technical advice. Sometimes you can actually use things like conditionality to get them to do things that they know they have to do anyhow. But that can also be a fairly problematic thing.
I was struck by what happened in Eastern Europe, which wasn't exactly, that the governments melted away. We had encouraged, but there had also been a growing civil society. Mm-hmm. In some countries it was the church, but there were other organizations. Some of them had U.S. money, CIA money, supporting them. And it wasn't so much that we were supporting, well, you should have this form of government or that, as we were supporting other civil forces within society.
Well, there's a huge industry devoted to democracy promotion that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. And I think that provides a lot of critical support. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine would not have happened if you had not been able to deploy election monitors, international election monitors, very quickly in a very cold December, to monitor that election. Support for civil society is a huge industry all over the world, and countries are changing as a result of that. If one way you get better governance, if you've got a government that is completely corrupt and the corruption starts at the top, how do you create accountable government? Well, it's got to be a bottom-up process. Unless you have civil society groups, a free press, people that can monitor abuses, there is simply no incentive for the governments to get better. And so this is, I think,
this is why Putin has tried to turn off all those foreign sources.
Well, it's not just Putin, right? It's Ahmadinejad and Mubarak and a lot of authoritarian leaders, because I think they recognize that this international network of civil society support really does create the grounds for more pluralism than any of them are comfortable with.
Well, I have many more questions to ask you, but I know that it is time to turn to our audience for questions. So let me now say, Frank Fukuyama, thank you very much for being here at the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
And while we're setting up for the questions, let me invite those of you in our viewing audience to write to us at PolicyWatch at UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland.edu, and give us your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Laurel Ball. I'm an incoming Masters of Public Policy student at the University of Maryland. My question is that you spoke of free trade as being key to the development of many countries. what effect do you see the breakdown of economic barriers having on international security?
Well, it really depends on the part of the world that you're talking about. And it really depends on whether you've got states that are at all cohesive and competent. So in East Asia, where you do have this kind of state, globalization and the reduction of trade barriers has been pretty largely a boon for everybody. But in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of Latin America where you have weak states that in some sense can't manage a lot of the stresses that are created by globalization, you have problems because there's a dark side of globalization that involves things like blood diamonds, money laundering, movement of refugees, populations that tend to undermine the governability of different societies. And so in some of those cases, I think globalization has actually has contributed to some of those endemic problems of poverty and corruption and the like.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you for being at the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.